And my name is Erin Reed, and I'm with Polaris MEP. Polaris MEP is the only nonprofit consultancy that is dedicated to helping Rhode Island's manufacturers grow. We are part of the NIST National Network of Manufacturing Extension Partnerships. That's the MEP in Polaris MEP. And today we're very excited to have Mary Johnson and Chris Cinieri explaining how to leverage that national network to improve your Rhode Island supply chain. For the first 20 minutes of today's webinar or so, they're going to be providing some insights and some resources that you can act on starting today. And in the second half, they will be opening up for questions and answers. So let's take a moment to explain how you can submit questions with this online platform. This is the Zoom control bar that most of you should be seeing on your screen somewhere. Number 1 on the far left is where you would be able to mute or unmute to talk. Today we've muted everyone so that we can make it easier to hear our presenters clearly. To submit questions or comments or ask for help troubleshooting or whatever you need, please use the chat button. That's what you'll see at number 6. It looks like a little message bubble. If you can use that, please, to type in any questions you have for the presenters, I will then go ahead and be able to pose them to our speakers in the second half of the program. That's how the control panel works. Now it's time to turn it over to Mary Johnson and Chris Cinieri.
Welcome, everybody. As Erin mentioned, Polaris MEP is the only nonprofit consultancy dedicated to helping Rhode Island manufacturers grow. And we are part of the NIST National Network of Manufacturing Extension Partnerships. I want to unpack that a bit because it will make the rest of the agenda that you're reading on your screen make sense. The Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program was started under the Reagan administration as a way to help small and mid-sized manufacturers compete with global competition. There is an organization that is designated as an MEP center in every state and in Puerto Rico, and they are tasked with helping manufacturers stay competitive and implement best practices. Polaris MEP is a business unit of the nonprofit URI Research Foundation, and we receive some federal and state funding as well as project income when we're working directly with manufacturing companies. We are not a federal or state agency, so unlike an SBDC or other federal business improvement organizations, we actually charge for our services. We help improve operations with companies and to help them reduce cycle time and improve flow. We create quality management systems and help companies prepare for internal audits, for their quality audits. And we help companies identify and adopt technology. We also work with companies to develop marketing and sales strategies and develop effective training systems and provide leadership coaching. Polaris MEP is also a connected intermediary organization, so we work closely with state and local governments and economic development organizations, the trade associations, and the universities to create collaborative networks and training programs that will impact the state's economy and a company's bottom line. So the power of being part of an MEP network is that there are people like us in every state who are deeply embedded in the local manufacturing community and in academia. So while our staff has years of experience in manufacturing and technology and workforce development and so forth, we're able to leverage a knowledge base that is much broader to network and share ideas, develop best practices, and connect manufacturers to each other across the country. It is a powerful and positive change agent, and the MEP centers are here to support the manufacturers in their community. So with that, one of our goals today is to discuss some of the best practices developed through the MEP system to reduce your risk of supply chain disruption. We'll also talk about services that will help you cope with crisis management, as many of you find yourself today, and talk about ways that you can leverage the MEP system to harness or participate in a growing domestic supply chain, mostly right at the moment for medical, but also non-medical personal protective equipment. So Chris, if you could hit the next slide, thank you. So this is an example. I have spent most of the last 2 months working on personal protective equipment and developing local resources, and helping companies that are pivoting to make masks and gowns. So the example I'm going to use is with PPE, but I think that your supply chain also probably looks similar to this graph or this chart. Whether you are manufacturing the end product or you are one of the suppliers feeding into a larger product, when everything's going smoothly, it's a fairly linear system. Everything is moving back and forth, and the dotted lines and the solid lines in this diagram are pretty much accurate. As manufacturers, you've probably survived slowdowns and disruptions over the years. We certainly live in an area where there are hurricanes. 2010 left a lot of us in flood zones that had not been flood zones in 500 years. And of course, there have been the recession in '88 and in 2008. Before the pandemic, I spent a lot of time working with companies who were trying to improve their cybersecurity resiliency, and also saw firsthand how disruptive ransomware attacks and other kinds of cyber threats could be to disrupting a company's ability to do business, which also would put their business and their supply chain at risk. So whether or not, no matter kind of what the disruption is, when this system fails to work, then you run into, of course, to challenges. So Christy, you want to hit the next slide for me, please? Many of the companies I've talked to over the last 3 years really were planning for fairly short-term disruptions. So this quote kind of sums it up, that 24 hours of disruption. And yes, that could create wild behavior, lose a lot of businesses, you'd lose a lot of business with even 24 hours of disruption. But what we're in now is a period where we're all, many companies are in a period of crisis management, but also the realization that needing to plan for longer term disruption is going to be part of our lives for a while. So we have to look broader at what are we going to do if our supply chain is down for a week or a month or a couple of months, rather than looking at short-term crises that will be over relatively soon. So what we're looking at now is supply chain that is being disrupted on many sides. So again, to go back to a PPE example, in a world where hospitals used to order from distributors who would contact the manufacturers, the distributors found themselves in a place where their global supply, especially for masks and gowns, disappeared. Factories in China were closed because they were having COVID outbreaks, and they were reserving they were creating their own strategic reserve and refilling their own strategic reserve rather than filling orders for the US. And so without that ability to work through a trusted distributor with whom they often had multi-year contracts, they had to start looking elsewhere to find the masks and the gowns that they needed. In Rhode Island, that typically, I know we were, and most of the hospital procurement offices were, deluged with people saying they were distributors or they had connections to distributors, and it was really hard to understand who was just out and out a fraud, who was trying to be helpful but probably wasn't as connected as they thought, and who was genuinely connected. There also, fairly quickly after the crisis hit, the state set up a procurement office to try to filter through a lot of that and create a central ability to monitor the supplies that the hospitals had, so that they weren't sitting on a 5-month supply or a 3-month supply if another hospital or a nursing home had a higher need because they were going to run out this week. So the state agencies kind of hopped in there, and the hospitals themselves are communicating both with the manufacturers and with the state agencies, and in some cases with FEMA directly. And that has created a lot of translation issues and communication issues because we're not used to talking to each other in this way. It is getting smoother every day. The system isn't going to be linear for a while. And the suppliers that you see on the left hand of the diagram often have their own supplies and materials that they have to bring in, which just compounds the problems throughout the system. What is true is that in order to fill orders on time, the manufacturers have to maintain their materials, and often Rhode Island is the base of where that product starts. We are a state where our manufacturing companies, 45% of them employ 4 or fewer people, and we are a bunch of small companies that make small pieces and components that go into much larger systems. So an example of how this new system has developed and iterated over the last couple of months is if you take, for instance, a textile manufacturer that I was working with who was not in the mask business, decided to get into the mask business, thought that they could manufacture masks, came to us for help locating materials that they might need. Through the Rhode Island Textile Innovation Network, we were able to connect them with a material manufacturer who had a polyester product that was appropriate for a non-medical mask. Also to a metal, the guy who made the metal stay, which was a jewelry company in Providence. And then there are several elastic suppliers in Pawtucket and Central Falls. And so that all of the base materials were here. We had to go out of state to find a cut and sew operation that was big enough to handle the manufacturing process. And she is now creating filling orders for masks in the military, in industry, and in municipalities at hundreds of thousands. So that was a success story. There were also stories of distilleries that have decided that they could, they had the raw materials to make hand sanitizer. They needed things like bottles and caps. And so through the different networks within Polaris and through the national MEP system, we were able to help link them to companies that could supply them with the caps and the bottles so that they would be able to distribute their own hand sanitizer. And so I'm going to turn it over to Chris now, and he's going to talk a little bit about how you can protect yourself if your supply chain is under pressure, or if your supply chain is looking more like a bowl of spaghetti than a straight line. So Chris, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Mary. So I think Mary's done a great job of explaining how we got here. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some best practices in the event that your supply chain is already impacted, or if it may become impacted. So if your supply chain is already impacted, some things that you can do. You want to consider your short and long-term impacts when making decisions. These can include your ability to make sales. Can you continue to do so? What are the impacts on your production? Can you keep producing? Also think about your staffing. If your production and sales are impacted, what impact does that have on your staffing? It's important that you realize that if a key supplier goes down, they're going down for all of their other customers, and those customers are going to start to reach out to alternative suppliers as well. So what are their capacity limits? And what will happen when you give them a call to try and get alternate supplies? One other thing you can do is reach out to Polaris for help finding alternative suppliers. We use the National MEP Scouting Network, and this is something that we're going to talk more about later. So if you suspect that there may be disruptions coming to your supply chain, what are some of the things that you can do? Well, you can contact them directly to confirm, and try to speak with more than one person to get a well-rounded picture of what's exactly taking place at their facility. You'll want to try to build inventories of critical raw materials if possible. You can secure production capacity by issuing a PO, and try securing transport capacity by having backup carriers. Start sourcing alternative suppliers, and we can help. And identify a resource to monitor the crisis and the impacts. And with this, it's not enough to delegate this to a purchasing manager. You'll want your operations team to be heavily involved as well, as they have a handle on the situation and what it takes to get your product out. So when should you start preparing for the next disruption? Well, today is a good day. And as a matter of fact, right after this webinar would be a good time. If I told you last year that we would go into an economic shutdown and people would be staying home all across the globe this year, you wouldn't have believed me. But here we are. It's not too early to take what we are learning now and apply it towards preparing for the next disruption. So you want to conduct the total cost of ownership analysis when you're looking at your supply chain. Think very similar to buying a new vehicle. If you have a $28,000 car, it's obviously cheaper than a $32,000 car, right? Well, maybe not once you consider miles per gallon, insurance, repair costs, etc. So many purchasing managers are incentivized to find the lowest cost, but it may not always be the best value. Conduct a risk assessment of your supply chain, and you can use common risk assessment tools such as FMEA, risk registers, or anything else that you might be comfortable with in your organization. Be sure to document these results as a part of your disaster plan. Strongly consider multiple sourcing, both locally and overseas. By diversifying globally, any localized disruptions such as natural disaster, geopolitical uprising, etc., will be mitigated. And have a disaster plan in place. It's much easier to have a playbook to follow during a crisis than creating one during a crisis. Also have a process to monitor global events to identify possible disruptions early. This could be subscriptions to publications, it could be subscription to a service that may provide this information, and it can also be membership to trade associations. Many times trade associations hear grumblings before they come to fruition and can really be a great source of information. So some of the other considerations when you're planning ahead, communication is key. You'll want to talk to your customers, your suppliers, your carriers, your brokers, your employees. Remember that impacts vary across the global supply chain. So even if you source a critical item locally, components in that critical item may come from overseas where disaster is struck. When disaster strikes, you will not be the only one trying to source alternative suppliers. So formulating a plan beforehand and having backup sources can help. Ask your suppliers what their disaster response plan is, and be sure to ask where you fit in and how you can work together now to mitigate disruption if something were to happen. So now Mary's going to talk a little bit more about how Polaris MEP can help.
So if you're looking to get some help with your supply chain and optimizing your supply chain, we can work with you and have worked with a number of clients to create a quality management system that includes regular risk assessments and a strong qualification process. It is likely that you will be facing additional qualifications if you're a supplier, and it's also good to take a look at the questions you are asking so that you can get a better sense of how much risk you're taking on when you take on a new supply chain partner. We can also help with strategic assessments and strategic planning services that can help you take a broader look at your business and see where you might offer value in different parts of the supply chain. Our Supplier Scouting program that Chris is going to talk to about in a little bit is a formal program that was formed during the Obama administration to help reshore manufacturing. It is a formal program to connect you to domestic suppliers, and it is a very specific, it has a very formal set of guidelines that you have to follow in order to participate in it. The supply chain technology acceleration programs can help you evaluate and adopt enterprise systems or learn to analyze data more effectively and create systems that can analyze your data more effectively so that you can improve your ability to forecast and order inputs. It can also help you monitor your supply chain and where items in your supply chain are as they are en route to you. We can also connect you with university partners who can help you solve technical problems, test materials, and develop new product lines. Finally, the MEP National Network offers a tech scouting program if you're looking specifically for technology to help your business be more competitive. B2B networks can be a really positive way to both learn about the risks, to hear, as Chris said earlier, to hear about warnings a little bit before they start to surface in the newspaper. And a client of mine was in Barcelona for a big textile trade show, and he met a representative from a company that was previously unknown to him that is now in his supply chain. And that company was less than 10 minutes from his office back home. So sometimes getting more involved in B2B networks like the Textile Innovation Network or the 401 Tech Bridge, the Composites Alliance, can help you connect into companies all across the supply chain that are either facing similar problems and you can share ideas, or can help you identify new supply chain partners. In Rhode Island especially, we tend to be, the word I'm hearing a lot lately is competimates, where they're companies that compete like crazy against each other, but also are good at teaming up when they need to in order to fill big orders or open themselves up to a new line of business. In the textile world, a company called Brickle in Woonsocket was able to put together an $84 million contract with the DoD by working together with about a half a dozen other companies in the local area, textile companies in the local area, to bid on a job that they would have been too small to get on their own. And then those are the kind of products that, or projects that happen when companies are connected to each other. Finally, the sustainability and improvement. Oftentimes you have a supplier who you rely on, you need, and you're also a little worried that they're not up to speed, whether that's with their cybersecurity posture, if they're in the defense supply chain, or if you just suspect that their manufacturing processes may not be using best practices. We can help companies across anywhere across your supply chain become more competitive, whether that's through helping them get ISO certification so that you can maintain your contractual obligations, or that's helping them become more lean, or with employee training. Again, as a nonprofit who is chartered with helping small and mid-sized manufacturers, we're here to help, and we function as a trusted advisor to make sure that you're getting good advice to run your business successfully. And Chris, I'll turn it back over to you to talk more about supplier scouting.
Thanks, Mary. So what is Supplier Scouting Network? Well, supplier scouting services are offered through Polaris MEP in addition to the many services you've come to know from us. This service allows us to leverage the power of the national MEP network of which we're a part. We send out a request to all MEP centers in all states. Each center has a point of contact for the program to ensure that the request does not go unnoticed. So if you find that you're in need of material or equipment, there's a short questionnaire to be filled out. And the questionnaire contains basic information, such as the type of material, if there's any critical specifications or standards it must meet, your anticipated volume, etc. We'll take that, put it into a short questionnaire, and send that out to the National Scouting Network. That request is open for 5 days, after which a formal report is generated and sent back to us containing information on prospective suppliers. So these suppliers have been vetted by MEP Center personnel for their ability to meet the requirements, as well as having the capacity to provide the material. In other words, this is better than opening up a Google search and hoping that you find somebody who can meet your needs. I'm going to give you an example, a recent example. Elastic material for face masks. So as Mary spoke about, a lot of companies have pivoted towards making face masks, and the need for elastic has gone up. Now, there are a lot of Rhode Island companies that produce this, but like we spoke about, there was already a great demand for it. So this company came to us and looked to find some elastic material. We put a notice out on the National Supplier Scouting Network, and within 5 days, we found 9 suppliers across the states who were ready and able to provide them with elastic material. So what's a good time to use this scouting program? Well, certainly during the COVID-19 crisis, if your supply chain has been impacted, or if you have pivoted to making a product that you don't normally make and find yourself in need of material you don't normally purchase, certainly reach out to us for help. But also, during normal business environment, to help you find backup suppliers as part of your disaster recovery plan, to help you find new suppliers when you're researching new product lines, or to help you become a part of a new supply chain when you're looking to increase sales. This service is not a product of the COVID-19 crisis. As Mary mentioned, it's been around since the Obama administration, but it's going to help you both now and going forward. So I'm going to let Mary close out with a few notes on what to expect going forward.
Thanks, Chris. And I want to add to that the Supplier Scouting program, they do anticipate that there's going to be a great increase in requests going through that program as the big three and other companies pivot to make things like ventilators. That the need will be broader than just textiles for masks and gowns. So one thing that makes the MEP system so effective at a supplier scouting program is that we have our boots on the ground and we know a lot about the local manufacturing community, but we're certainly not in touch with every one of the 1,600 manufacturers in Rhode Island. So the more we know about you, the more we can help you if you're trying to connect into these systems. And so I would encourage you to give us a call. Let's talk more about your business so that we have a better understanding of what you do and what you offer. And that allows us to help when the formal requests come in through the Supplier Scouting program or more informal requests come in for products on a more informal and day-to-day way. So anyway, as we're going forward, kind of the things that we're expecting to happen is that companies are going to start spreading out their supply chain a little bit more and perhaps bringing more of that into domestic production. That can be good news, especially for contract manufacturers. We have a lot of them here. But it may also put some stress on our contract manufacturers who are used to having contracts where they're pretty close to being a sole provider. So they may see more competition, but it's also an opportunity to get in and compete with companies you may not have been able to compete with in the past. We expect that there will be more scrutiny during the qualification process. More questionnaires, additional requirements, contractual obligations may change, and that may push risk and requirements to you in terms of penalties if you're not able to fulfill an order, or kind of black marks against your account if you're late or not providing your supply as expected. Oftentimes now, those are data-driven systems. ExoStar is used quite often with companies that are in the defense world that are primes. And I have a client who had said, you used to be able to say, oh yeah, that's on the truck when they called, and that you can't get away with that anymore because the systems monitor from point A to point B so tightly that they know where your product is every step of the way, and that there are penalties for not being on time. Hopefully we will see, as Chris talked earlier, a more holistic approach to value versus everyone just looking for the lower price. One of the things in the medical world that I heard a lot of the first couple of weeks was, well, we're used to paying less than $3 for a gown. You know, we've been locked into these contracts, and now you're telling me they're going to be $10. That's price gouging. And it's not price gouging, it's the cost of setting up a new supply chain in 2 weeks' time, in a new line in 2 weeks' time. The costs of that have to be covered. But there is also risk in relying on the cheapest possible product if it has to be shipped here from overseas. So sometimes it's worth it to look at the whole value of the relationship rather than just the cost. Erin, I think that that's it for me. If you want to take questions, we'd be happy to take questions at this point.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Chris. This was excellent to hear about the process that's been in place and how it's kind of accelerating and twisting a little bit to help people with the COVID-19 challenges. We got a few questions by chat, and so I wanted to see if we could kind of queue them up. Chris, the first one is actually for you. At one point, you mentioned keeping an inventory of raw materials as one way to manage your supply chain and kind of build in some buffers for future problems. But this person has said, we are a lean plant. We don't keep stockpiles of anything if we can help it. Chris, could you talk a little bit about lean and supply chain disruptions?
Yeah, that's actually a great point. And I think that a lot of companies, whether or not they fully embrace lean principles, they all realize that inventory is the enemy, at least in terms of cost. However, when you're talking about a pending supply chain disruption or a current supply chain disruption, then the decision becomes, do I want to continue to produce or not? So if there's a possibility that you could lose critical material, understand that you could go without producing product. You could miss customer orders. You could miss the opportunity to pivot and become helpful during the situation. It's really a business decision. But if your decision is to keep running as best as you possibly can, then you might have to suspend that thinking for the time being and just kind of get ahead on your supply a bit.
Thank you very much. All right, so Mary, this one is for you because you have been the growth and strategy manager here at Polaris MEP. Is supplier scouting a way people could increase sales?
Yes, absolutely. And everybody is looking to increase sales, right? Every day, all day. Because it gives you access to new markets and new opportunities. It can be a way to help companies broaden out the companies to whom they supply. Again, it helps if we know what to do in advance, because then we can make connections in the informal channels as well as the formal channels. But we are always happy to talk more about what your strategy is and what kind of sales and what your value proposition is, and so that we can match you to opportunities as we hear of them.
Thank you, Mary. Chris, you talked about planning, but this person says, isn't the horse out of the barn on planning?
No, I would say actually you can start today. And I think I mentioned right after this webinar is a good time. At any point, you can take what we've learned in the last 6 weeks and start to apply it. So I've heard people say we're currently living in the new normal. Well, what does that look like for your business? And what have you done so far? If your doors are still open and you're still running, you're doing something correctly, definitely take note of what you're doing and make it a part of that business continuity or that disaster recovery plan that we spoke of. Because 6 months from now, you won't remember everything that you went through. So while it would have been great to have done this before, the fact that we're here now, let's leverage what we've learned so far and make it a part of our disaster recovery plan going forward.
Thank you. All right, we had another question, and it's related to the National MEP Network database. So this is for either one of you. Is it a searchable database? Is it public?
No, actually, because MEP centers are independent organizations who have a contract to be an MEP system, or to be designated as the MEP provider in the state. They all maintain their own independent business systems. We don't have a connected MEP business system. So our way of connecting is a very human one. I work very closely with the MEP centers throughout New England on cybersecurity, and we have a weekly call where we're discussing challenges and opportunities and sharing ideas about excuse me, vendors that we've identified that might be able to provide services in each state. So no, there is not a national database that can be accessed.
It kind of reminds me of the old Rhode Island saying that if you want something, somebody always knows a guy, right? And in this case, it sounds like supplier scouting is a way to put a process around that so that you get to the guy who knows the guy as quickly as you can. to solve your
Yes, and I
problem.
would say in the most positive way possible. I know a guy gets a bad reputation sometimes in Rhode Island, but this is a very positive. I know a guy that we're out to try to help companies compete fairly to get as much business as they can.
Perfect. Well then, Chris, I'm going to ask you to advance to the last screen and just remind everybody that if you're interested in learning more about the Supplier Scouting program, perhaps you yourself could use what is being offered through the program, or you know a manufacturer, you know that guy who could use the extra help solving some of their supply chain problems. Please call Chris today. The information is on the slide. We thank all of you for joining us at today's webinar, and please stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.